Hi, I'm Rashonda Cade. This is Reading with Rashonda. We are reading Behind the Scenes by Elizabeth Keckley. But before we jump into that today, I wanted to read a bit to you from an article I read. The article is by Dr. Jamila Lissakat, and she published it on Medium. The title of the article is The Tyranny of White Comfort: Centering Black Students in the Face of Hateful Legislation. And it was an interesting article talking about how centering our educational endeavors on white comfort means that we will never talk about the truth of Black history or Indigenous history or women's history or all sorts of stuff, but she was focused on African Americans and our contributions and how we are uncomfortable all the time so that white people can be comfortable. And so she had a few paragraphs that I wanted to read to you that I think really speaks to specifically what's happening in Behind the Scenes by Elizabeth Keckley, but more broadly, it speaks to part of the reason I'm doing this and why I think it's important for people to read this literature. So Dr. Lissakat says, when I see how fiercely this nation seeks to protect white comfort, I can only think of our ancestors who smiled when they did not want to smile and danced when they did not want to dance, because white discomfort could easily cost them their lives. Some of the first attempts of Black people to author their truths about the violence of racism in America were written in 18th and 19th century slave narratives written and orated by the enslaved to persuade the abolition of slavery, and even then they had to tread carefully around the tyranny of white comfort. I actually highlighted a couple of other paragraphs, but I think that's probably sufficient for what the point is I'm trying to make. So for Mrs. Keckley and every other slave, keeping the white people around her comfortable meant she could live another day. Now, for most of this book that we're reading, she is not a slave, but it is evident that part of her job is to keep white people comfortable. She is keeping Mrs. Lincoln comfortable by doing all sorts of things that are outside the scope of her job as a seamstress. Even the language that she uses keeps her white audience of readers comfortable. She has glossed over many, many things. And one of the things that she glossed over was her own grief at her son's dying. We heard about that just as a passing note. Oh, and by the way, my son died. But we heard in depth at the grief of President and Mrs. Lincoln when their son died. And I can only imagine that was to keep white people comfortable. So white people didn't have to hear and feel all of the ugliness that was probably tied to the death of her son. How did he die? What were the circumstances? Was she even allowed to grieve and mourn? How was he laid to rest? I'm sure all of those things are in just stark contrast to how the Lincolns were able to express their grief. Even though they were constrained by being figureheads of a country, they still felt their grief, they expressed it. We see where Mrs. Lincoln is short and petty and has jealousies. We see her as a human. I'm not faulting her. I have my moments. We all do. But what I'm saying is that Elizabeth Keckley has set out from the very beginning of what she has said to say that some of what she is doing is so that white people continue to feel comfortable with her, even though of her association with the Lincolns. And we see this in all kinds of the readings that we've been doing. But what we also see is some subversion of that. And that's really what has drawn me to this literature. When we see the highlighting of making white people comfortable, but then we see the little digs, like the digs of showing that Mrs. Lincoln was petty and jealous at times, the digs of showing that President Lincoln wasn't like this, ah, that we often paint him to be. We get to see a little bit into the industriousness of Mrs. Keckley. Like she bim bam boom got that whole organization going. She was like, I'm gonna sew and I'm gonna get myself up out of slavery. So we also see the subversiveness in this, and I really enjoy that tension, and I look for those moments and those movements, and I hope you do too. So that was a little bit of, I can't call it background, contextualizing for our reading for today. And so we are on chapter 8 of Behind the Scenes by Elizabeth Keckley, and we'll get started. Chapter 8, Candid Opinions. Often Mr. and Mrs. Lincoln discussed the relations of cabinet officers and gentlemen prominent in politics in my presence. Most likely because they felt comfortable with her being there. And during slavery days, white people said an extraordinary amount of things in front of slaves because they were like, they're not people. They're not paying attention. They don't know what we're talking about. Wrong, wrong, wrong. So that may be part of the reason why they say a lot in front of Mrs. Keckley. I'll continue. I soon learned that the wife of the president had no love for Mr. Salmon P. Chase, at that time Secretary of the Treasury. She was well versed in human character and was somewhat suspicious of those by whom she was surrounded, and often her judgment was correct. Her intuition about the sincerity of individuals was more accurate than that of her husband. She looked beyond and read the reflection of action in the future. Her hostility to Mr. Chase was very bitter. She claimed that he was a selfish politician instead of a true patriot, and warned Mr. Lincoln not to trust him too far. The daughter of the secretary was quite a belle in Washington, and Mrs. Lincoln, who was jealous of the popularity of others, had no desire to build up her social position through political favor to her father. Miss Chase, now Mrs. Senator Sprague, was a lovely woman and was worthy of all the admiration she received. Mr. Lincoln was more confiding than his wife. He never suspected the fidelity of those who claimed to be his friends. Aw, that's actually pretty sweet to never to be in politics and not suspect the sincerity of the people who claim to be your friends. That's beautiful. Unwise, but beautiful. Honest to the very core of himself and frank as a child, he never dreamed of questioning the sincerity of others. Father, I do wish that you would inquire a little into the motives of Chase, said his wife one day. The president was lying carelessly upon a sofa, holding a newspaper in his hands. Mother, you are too suspicious. I give you credit for sagacity, but you are disposed to magnify trifles. Chase is a patriot and one of my best friends. Yes, one of your best friends, because it is in his interest to be so. He is anything for Chase. If he thought he could make anything by it, he would betray you tomorrow. I fear that you are prejudiced against the man, Mother. I know that you do him injustice. Mr. Lincoln, you are either blind or will not see. I am not the only one that has warned you against him. True. I receive letters daily from all parts of the country telling me not to trust Chase. But then these letters are written by the political enemies of the secretary, and would be unjust and foolish to pay any attention to them. Aw, Puddin'. Very well. You will find out someday, if you live long enough, that I have read the man correctly. If you live long enough, foretelling, foretelling. Or maybe in her case, premonition. And it's funny to me that I have read the man correctly, and the way we use the term reading people. Like you can read somebody and who they are, but like you can also read somebody and dress them down and let them know who they are. I only hope that your eyes may not be open to the truth when it is too late. That is the worst time to have your eyes open to the truth, once it's too late. Better late than never, though, right? The president, as far as I could judge from his conversation with his wife, continued to confide in Mr. Chase to the time of his tragic death. Mrs. Lincoln was especially severe on Mr. William H. Seward, Secretary of State. She but rarely lost an opportunity to say an unkind word of him. Wow. One morning I went to the White House earlier than usual. Mr. Lincoln Mr. Lincoln was sitting in a chair reading a paper, stroking with one hand the head of little Tad. I was basting a dress for Mrs. Lincoln. Um, Basting is like it's like creating a hymn, but it's not supposed to last forever, but so you can get through what you're trying to get through. That's what I understand of sewing. I know how to sew. I am nobody's seamstress though, but I didn't want you to think it was basting like you baste a turkey and you pour the juice over it. I was basting a dress for Mrs. Lincoln. A servant entered and handed the president a letter just brought by a messenger. He broke the seal, and when he had read the contents, his wife asked, "Who is the letter from, father?" "Seward. I must go over and see him today." "Seward? I wish you had nothing to do with that man. He cannot be trusted." "You say the same of Chase. If I listened to you, I should soon be without a cabinet." "Better be without it than to confide in some of the men that you do. Seward is worse than Chase. He has no principle." "Mother, you are mistaken. Your prejudices are so violent that you do not stop to reason. Seward is an able man, and the country as well as myself can trust him." All pudding. "Father, you are too honest for this world. You should have been born a saint. You will generally find it a safe rule to distrust a disappointed, ambitious politician." That actually is a pretty safe rule to distrust a disappointed, ambitious politician. I'll continue. "It makes me mad to see you sit still and let that hypocrite Seward twine you around his finger as if you were a skein of thread." "It is useless to argue the question, mother. You cannot change my opinion." Mrs. Lincoln prided herself upon her ability to read character. She was shrewd and far seeing and had no patience with the frank, confiding nature of the president. When Andrew Johnson was urged for military governor of Tennessee, Mrs. Lincoln bitterly opposed the appointment. "He is a demagogue," she said almost fiercely, "and if you place him in power, Mr. Lincoln, mark my words, you will rue it some day." General McClellan, when made commander in chief, was the idol of commander in chief. So I am used to the president being commander in chief, but I do not know when that happened. Apparently, at some point after Lincoln was president, because there is a person who is not Lincoln who is commander in chief and is not the president. Let me go back to that. General McClellan, when made commander in chief, was the idol of the soldiers and never was a general more universally popular. "He is a humbug," remarked Mrs. Lincoln one day in my presence. "What makes you think so, mother?" good naturedly inquired the president. "Because he talks so much and does so little." I'm going to call people a humbug now if they talk so much and do so little. Humbug. You. You're a humbug. You talk so much and do so little. We all know I'm not really going to do that, but I might think about it. Anyway, I'll keep reading. "Because he talks so much and does so little. If I had the power, I would very soon take off his head and put some energetic man in his place." Wow, she wants to decapitate him? That seems a little extreme. I am reading a series of books. It's called The Dragon something by Morgan Rice. But anyway, every time there's a fight, people's heads are just all getting lopped off. I'm like, oh my gosh. They're like, he removed his opponent's head from his neck. Oh, swordsmanship. Let me get back to this book, not one of the many other books that I'm reading. Okay, so Lincoln is speaking now. "But I regard McClellan as a patriot and an able soldier. He has been much embarrassed. The troops are raw and the subordinate officers inclined to be rebellious. There are too many politicians in the army with shoulder straps. McClellan is young and popular, and they are jealous of him. They will kill him off if they can." Okay. I'm pausing some because Back in this day, we've talked about it in some other novels, they do not always include the tags for who is speaking. So I got a little confused about who was speaking. But Mrs. Lincoln said McClellan talks too much and should be decapitated. President Lincoln said, no, this must still be Mrs. Lincoln. Okay, this is still Mrs. Lincoln, I think. Yeah, okay. So Mrs. Lincoln says, because he talks so much and does so little, if I had the power, I would very soon take off his head and put some energetic man in his place. It was the but that made me think it was President Lincoln talking, but what was said sounds more like Mrs. Lincoln. No, no, no. This is President Lincoln who said, but I regard McClellan as a patriot and an able soldier. Okay, that was President Lincoln. And then Mrs. Lincoln rebuffs and replies, McClellan can make plenty of excuse for himself, therefore he needs no advocate in you. If you would only do something and not promise so much, I might learn to have a little faith in him. I tell you, he is a humbug, and you will have to find some man to take his place. That is, if you wish to conquer the South. Mrs. Lincoln could not tolerate General Grant. He is a butcher, she would often say, and is not fit to be at the head of an army. But he has been very successful in the field, argued the president. Yes, he generally manages to claim a victory, but such a victory. He loses 2 men to the enemy's 1. He has no management, no regard for life. If the war should continue 4 years longer and he should remain in power, he would depopulate the North. I could fight an army as well myself. According to his tactics, there is nothing under the heavens to do but to march a new line of men up in front of the rebel breastworks to be shot down as fast as they take their position, and keep marching until the enemy grows tired of the slaughter. Grant, I repeat, is an obstinate fool and a butcher. She had strong opinions. Well, mother, supposing that we give you command of the army, no doubt you would do much better than any general that has been tried. There was a twinkle in his eyes and a ring of irony in his voice. I have often heard Mrs. Lincoln say that if Grant should ever be elected President of the United States, she would desire to leave the country and remain absent during his term of office. I'm feeling ashamed at my knowledge of U.S. history, but I do in fact believe Grant was elected president. And I am now curious if Mrs. Lincoln left the country. Somebody find out. If you if you know, will you post it in the comments? Thank you. It was well known that Mrs. Lincoln's brothers were in the Confederate Army, and for this reason it was often charged that her sympathies were with the South. Those who made the hasty charge were never more widely mistaken. One morning on my way to the White House, I heard that Captain Alexander Todd, one of her brothers, had been killed. I did not like to inform Mrs. Lincoln of his death, judging that it would be painful news to her. I had been in her room but a few minutes when she said with apparent unconcern, Lizzie, I have just heard that one of my brothers has been killed in the war. I also heard the same, Mrs. Lincoln, but hesitated to speak of it for fear the subject would be a painful one to you. You need not hesitate. Of course, it is but natural that I should feel for one so nearly related to me, but not to the extent that you suppose. He made his choices long ago. He decided against my husband, and through him, against me. He has been fighting against us, and since he chose to be our deadly enemy, I see no special reason why I should bitterly mourn his death. Wow! 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 Your brother just died, and you're like, I feel bad because he was my brother, but he chose the wrong side. He was against my husband. He was against me. I don't feel too bad about it. I would feel feel awful if my brother died. Now, my brother and I have never been like ideologically opposed to one another, and I suppose that can make a difference. But wow, that was hard core. Hurt my heart there. Oh, mm. Let's keep reading. I'm hungry. Okay, that had nothing to do with anything. You didn't need to know I was hungry, but now you do. We've only got like 2 pages left, so I suppose in a few minutes I'll be able to get something to eat. All the tangents. Sorry about that. I felt relieved and in subsequent conversations learned that Mrs. Lincoln had no sympathy for the South. Why should I sympathize with the rebels? She would say. Are they not against me? They would hang my husband tomorrow if it was in their power and perhaps gibbet me with him. How then can I sympathize with a people at war with me and mine? She always objected to being thought Southern in feeling. I guess so. Mr. Lincoln was generous by nature, and though his whole heart was in the war, he could not but respect the valor of those opposed to him. His soul was too great for the narrow, selfish views of partisanship. Brave by nature himself, he honored bravery in others, even his foes. Time and again I have heard him speak in the highest terms of the soldierly qualities of such brave Confederate generals as Lee, Stonewall Jackson, and Joseph E. Johnson. Jackson was his ideal soldier. He is a brave, honest Presbyterian soldier, were his words. What a pity that we should have to fight such a gallant fellow. If we only had such a man to lead the armies of the North, the country would not be appalled with so many disasters. Like, I get that, except for ideologically, you wouldn't want somebody leading. Like, hmm. As this is a rambling chapter, she said that. It's not all that rambling on her part, rambling on mine, though. How'd she know I was going to ramble? Anyway, as this is a rambling chapter, I will here record an incident showing his feeling toward Robert E. Lee. The very morning of the day on which he was assassinated, his son, Captain Robert Lincoln, came into the room with a portrait of General Lee in his hand. The president took the picture, laid it on a table before him, scanned the face thoughtfully, and said, "It is a good face. It is the face of a noble, noble, brave man. I am glad that the war is over at last." Looking up, was the war really over though? Looking up at Robert, he continued, "Well, my son, you have returned safely from the front. The war is now closed, and we soon will live in peace with the brave men that have been fighting against us. I trust that the era of good feeling has returned with the war, and that henceforth we shall live in peace. Now listen to me, Robert. You must lay aside your uniform and return to college. I wish you to read law for 3 years, and at the end of that time, I hope that we will be able to tell whether you will make a lawyer or not." His face was more cheerful than I had seen it for a long while, and he seemed to be in a generous, forgiving mood. Aw, aw, all of that on the day he was assassinated. That's something. So that was chapter 8 of Behind the Scenes by Elizabeth Keckley. I'm Rashonda Cade, and this is Reading with Rashonda.